There is a distinct difference between a piece of junk and a piece of history, though to the untrained eye they often look exactly the same. When a frail, elderly black woman walked into Mitchell Tactical and Precision in Cheyenne, Wyoming, carrying what appeared to be a rotting fence post wrapped in filthy burlap, the young gunsmith behind the counter could not help the laugh that escaped his throat. Jamal Mitchell was 24 years old and already considered one of the finest custom gunsmiths in the state. His shop was a temple to modern precision engineering. The walls were lined with matte black aerospace-grade aluminum chassis, carbon fiber barrels, and optics that cost more than a reliable used car. Jamal dealt in tolerances measured in 10 thousandths of an inch. He was talented, undeniably arrogant, and had absolutely zero patience for nostalgia. To Jamal, firearms were machines, mathematical equations of pressure and ballistics meant to be optimized. It was a cold Tuesday afternoon in late November 2010 when the brass bell above the heavy glass door chimed. Jamal did not look up from his workbench. His eyes were glued to the magnification loupe as he polished the sear engagement of a custom trigger group destined for a competitive shooter in Denver. "Be right with you," Jamal muttered, wiping a streak of synthetic oil from his forehead. "Take your time, young man. I have got nothing but time these days," a brittle, reedy voice replied. Jamal finally set his tools down and walked out to the showroom floor. Standing there was a woman who looked to be in her late 80s. She wore a faded wool coat that had likely been out of style since the Nixon administration, and her silver hair was pulled back into a tight, practical bun. Her hands wrapped in thin leather gloves were clutching a long, heavy object bundled tightly in stained burlap and tied with dry, rotted twine. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" Jamal asked, forcing a polite but hurried smile. "Looking for a gift for a grandson." "No," the woman said. Her name was Loretta Davies. "I am looking for someone to appraise and perhaps restore an item. My husband Marcus passed away a few months ago. I am clearing out the basement. He told me before he died that if I ever needed money, I should take this to a professional." Jamal sighed internally. He hated these interactions. Once a week, someone brought in an old rusted shotgun or a beat-up hunting rifle they found in an attic, convinced it was a priceless antique. 99% of the time, it was a mass-produced clunker worth $50 if that. "All right, let's see what you have got," Jamal said, gesturing to the rubber mat on the glass display counter. Loretta lifted the heavy bundle with surprising effort, letting it hit the counter with a dull, heavy thud that sounded more like a log than a precision instrument. Jamal pulled a pocket knife from his denim apron and sliced through the brittle twine. As he unrolled the burlap, a pungent stomach-turning smell hit the air. A mixture of mildew, decaying wood, oxidized steel, and the unmistakable sickly sweet stench of ancient hardened cosmoline. When the final layer of fabric fell away, Jamal could not stop the bark of laughter that escaped his throat. Laying on the mat was a Springfield M1903 bolt-action rifle, or at least what was left of one. The walnut stock was completely black, with age gouged, splintered, and seemingly rotting from the inside out. The metal was a disaster. There was not a speck of original bluing left. The entire barrel and receiver were caked in a thick, scaly crust of orange and brown rust. The bolt was fused shut, welded by decades of neglect and moisture. It looked like it had been buried in a swamp, dug up and left in a damp cellar for 50 years. Ma'am, Jamal chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag just from being near it. "I do not know who told your husband this was valuable, but they were pulling his leg. This is not a firearm anymore. This is a tomato stake. It is a wall hanger for a dive bar. Maybe good for a movie prop if someone needs a beat-up rifle from World War I. Loretta did not blink. Her pale blue eyes remained fixed on Jamal. "Marcus said it was important." Marcus was mistaken. Jamal said, his tone turning a bit patronizing. "Look at this. The pitting on the barrel is so deep it is unsafe to ever fire again. The action is seized solid. If I try to put a wrench on this bolt, the handle will snap right off. Even if this is an original Springfield in this condition, I could not give you more than $40 for it. And that is just for the scrap metal and maybe the butt plate. I did not ask you to buy it for $40, Loretta, said, her voice dropping a fraction of an octave, carrying a sudden steely weight that caught Jamal off guard. I asked you to appraise it. I just did. Jamal smirked, leaning against the counter. It is junk. I am sorry for your loss, ma'am. I really am. But you carried a heavy piece of scrap iron and all the way down here for nothing. You should take it to a scrap yard. They will give you more than I can. Loretta reached a gloved hand out and rested it gently on the rotted wood of the stock. My husband was a quiet man. He worked at the rail yard in Cheyenne for 42 years. He never lied. He never exaggerated. And on his deathbed, he made me promise not to let some arrogant kid cheat me out of what this rifle represents. Jamal's smile vanished. The insult stung mostly because it was delivered with such calm precision. Ma'am, I am not cheating you. I am telling you the reality of metallurgy and antique firearms. This thing has been neglected so badly that whatever value it once had is gone. The rust is not just surface bloom, it is deep pitting. That means the metal has been compromised at a molecular level. Then humor a grieving widow, Loretta said, pulling a $20 bill from her purse and slapping it on the glass. Take a brass brush and some solvent, clean off the top of the receiver, just enough so you can read the serial number. That is all I ask. If it is just a piece of scrap iron, I will take my trash and leave. You can keep the 20 for your time. Jamal looked at the $20 bill, then at the ruined rifle, and finally at Loretta. He was annoyed, but his pride as a tradesman was piqued. He wanted to prove her wrong, to show her that no magical serial number was going to reverse half a century of deep iron oxide. Keep your money, Jamal said curtly. He grabbed the rifle by the forend, surprised by how dense and heavy the rotting wood still felt despite its appearance. Give me 10 minutes. I will get the rust off the receiver. But when I come back and tell you it is a standard issue run-of-the-mill infantry rifle from 1918, you are taking it out of my shop. Deal, Loretta said softly, crossing her arms. Jamal carried the heavy rusted relic into the back room, laying it on his primary workbench under the glaring fluorescent lights. Up close, the damage was even worse than it appeared on the showroom floor. The rust was not just surface bloom. It was deeply ingrained, pitting the steel in microscopic craters. He secured the rifle in a padded bench vise, clamping down on the ruined stock. He grabbed a can of industrial penetrating oil and sprayed a generous coating over the receiver ring, the area just behind the barrel where the manufacturer's stamp and serial number would be. The oil hissed slightly as it seeped into the porous rust. Stubborn old lady, Jamal muttered to himself as he pulled on a pair of black nitrile gloves. He waited 3 minutes for the solvent to work its way into the crust, then picked up a stiff, bristled bronze brush. He began to scrub. At first, nothing happened. The rust was like concrete. He applied more pressure, his arm muscles flexing as he ground the bronze bristles against the steel. A slurry of brown sludge began to form. Jamal wiped it away with a blue shop towel and sprayed more solvent. Layer by layer, the decades of neglect began to peel back. The smell of the ancient rust mixing with the chemical solvent filled the small workspace. Jamal switched to a finer brass brush, not wanting to scratch whatever metal remained underneath. Slowly, the faint outlines of letters began to emerge from the scarred steel. U.S. Springfield Armory Model 1903. Yeah, big surprise, Jamal whispered sarcastically. Millions of these had been made. They were the workhorses of the First World War and saw heavy use in the early days of the Second. Finding one was not a rarity. Finding one in this horrible condition was just a tragedy. But Loretta had been specific. Look at the serial number. Jamal focused his brushing lower down on the receiver ring. He sprayed a direct blast of solvent and scrubbed vigorously. The sludge wiped away, revealing a surprisingly clean patch of dark, hardened steel right where the numbers were stamped. He grabbed his magnifying loupe, leaning over the workbench. The number began to take shape. 4101934. Jamal stopped brushing. He frowned. He wiped the metal again, making absolutely sure there was no grit obscuring the digits. He looked through the loop again. A strange coldness washed over Jamal's neck. He stepped back from the workbench, his heart giving a weird, erratic thump against his ribs. He was not a historian, but his grandfather had been a master armorer, and Jamal had grown up surrounded by massive, dusty reference books detailing the production histories of American military firearms. Certain numbers, certain production blocks were drilled into his head during late-night lectures in his grandfather's cramped Detroit garage before the old man had passed when Jamal was 16. The Springfield M1903 had a notoriously complex production history. Millions were made, but the 4101900 serial block was different. Jamal walked over to a metal filing cabinet in the corner of his shop. He pulled open the bottom drawer and dug past stacks of modern blueprints until he found a heavy leather-bound book. The Springfield 1903 Rifles by Lieutenant Colonel William S. Brophy. It was the Bible of military firearm appraisers. He hauled the heavy book onto his desk and flipped frantically through the glossy pages, scanning the appendices for serial number production blocks. His finger traced down the columns of numbers. He found the section for late production rifles, specifically those manufactured during the desperate early years of World War II, when Remington had taken over production. But this was not a Remington stamp. This was Springfield. Jamal's finger stopped. He read the paragraph associated with the block 4101900 to 4102000. His breath hitched in his throat. According to the official Ordnance Department records, that specific block of 100 serial numbers did not technically exist in standard infantry distribution. They were pulled from the assembly line in 1942. They were pulled for a highly classified experimental modification program tied to the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA. They were fitted with experimental suppressed barrels and specialized optics meant for deep cover operatives dropping behind enemy lines in occupied France. Most were destroyed before the war ended to protect the technology. The rest were strictly accounted for, locked away in government vaults, or displayed in highly secure military museums. There had been rumors in the collector community for decades that a few had gone missing, smuggled back in duffel bags by operatives who officially did not exist. Jamal rushed back to the vise. He unclasped the rifle and lifted it. He looked closer at the ruin-pitted barrel. It was thicker than a standard barrel, much thicker. The rust had disguised its true dimensions. And the rotted wood of the forend, it was not just splintered, it had been custom routed to accommodate the wider girth of an integrated silencer. He was holding an OSS Hush Puppy Springfield. Even in this abysmal ruined condition, the receiver alone was a holy grail of military collecting. It belonged in the Smithsonian. To a private high-end collector, this rusted tomato steak was easily worth $50,000 to $80,000. Jamal swallowed hard, his throat dry. He looked toward the door leading back to the showroom. Loretta Davies was waiting out there. Marcus Davies, the quiet rail yard mechanic, was her husband. Who the hell was Marcus Davies? Jamal walked back into the showroom. He moved slower now, the heavy rusted rifle cradled in his hands, not like a piece of junk, but like a volatile explosive. The cocky swagger he had possessed 20 minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed look of absolute bewilderment. Loretta was standing exactly where he had left her, her posture perfectly straight, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. She watched his face intently as he approached the glass counter. She did not look triumphant. She just looked deeply, profoundly tired. Jamal gently, almost reverently laid the rifle back down on the rubber mat. He did not speak for a long moment. He just stared at the old woman. "You found the numbers," Loretta said quietly. It was not a question. "I found them," Jamal managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am Loretta, do you have any idea what this is?" "I know exactly what it is," she replied. "It is a Springfield 1903, serial number 4101934. It is not just a Springfield," Jamal insisted, leaning forward, his voice a hushed whisper, as if afraid someone might overhear them. "This serial block, it is restricted. It is undocumented in standard military logistics. This was a custom-modified weapon for the OSS. These were issued to men who were dropped behind Nazi lines in 1943, men who officially were never there. They were ordered to be destroyed after the war. How does your husband have one? Loretta offered a small, sad smile. Marcus always was terrible at following orders. Jamal's mind was racing. You said he was a mechanic at the rail yard. He was? Loretta nodded. From 1946 until he retired in 1988, he fixed diesel engines. He paid his taxes. He went to church on Sundays. And he never raised his voice. He was the gentlest man I ever knew. She paused, her eyes dropping to the rusted metal on the counter. But before 1946, he was someone else. He never told me his rank. He never told me his unit. But I knew the nightmares he had. I heard the German he spoke in his sleep, even though he claimed he only knew English. How did he get it back here? Jamal asked, entirely captivated now. The risk of smuggling a classified suppressed sniper rifle back to the States. He could have been sent to Leavenworth for treason. He did not smuggle it, a new voice echoed from the front door. Jamal jumped. He had not heard the bell chime. Standing in the doorway was a black man in his late 60s wearing a crisp, dark suit that looked entirely out of place in a Wyoming gun shop. He had silver hair, military posture, and a hard, assessing stare. He held a leather briefcase in his left hand. Loretta turned a look of profound relief washing over her face. You made it, Darius. I told you I would, Loretta, the man said, stepping into the shop and closing the door behind him. He locked the deadbolt. Jamal took a step back, his hand instinctively dropping toward the concealed pistol on his hip. Hey, what are you doing? Shop is open. You cannot lock that. The man named Darius ignored Jamal's protest. He walked directly to the counter and set his briefcase down. He looked at the rusted rifle, his eyes softening for a brief second before returning to their hard professional state. My name is Darius Thompson, the man said, pulling a leather wallet from his breast pocket and flipping it open. Jamal caught a flash of a heavy gold federal badge and the letters DOD, Department of Defense. And Mr. Mitchell, to answer your question about how Marcus Davies brought this weapon home, he did not. The government let him keep it. Jamal was completely lost. Why would the government let a mechanic keep a classified assassination weapon? Because Darius said, his voice dropping to a gravelly register. In the winter of 1944, in a frozen forest outside of Bastogne, Belgium, Marcus Davies spent 4 days alone behind enemy lines. His unit was wiped out. He used this specific rifle and its integrated suppressor to systematically eliminate the command structure of an advancing German panzer division. He caused so much chaos, so much silent death, that the German commanders believed they were surrounded by a regiment of ghost snipers. They halted their advance for 48 hours, waiting for reinforcements. Darius reached out and ran a finger along the pitted receiver. That 48-hour delay allowed General Patton's Third Army to break the siege of Bastogne. Marcus Davies saved thousands of American lives. When they finally found him, he was half frozen out of ammunition and refusing to let go of this rifle. Jamal stared at the rusted wood and steel. The smell of the old Cosmoline suddenly did not smell like decay anymore. It smelled like history. It smelled like survival. They could not give him a Medal of Honor, Loretta said quietly, a tear finally slipping down her wrinkled cheek, because officially the mission he was on before Bastogne never happened. His commanding officers did not exist on paper. And there was another reason, too. In 1945, the military was not eager to publicly celebrate a black sharpshooter who had killed dozens of white officers, even if they were Nazis. The optics were complicated. So a very high-ranking general, Darius's grandfather, actually pulled Marcus aside before he was discharged. My grandfather signed a piece of paper, Darius finished, classified the rifle as destroyed in combat. He handed the weapon back to Marcus in a burlap sack and told him to take it home, hide it, and never speak of it. It was the only reward a shadow could be given, especially a black shadow in 1945. Jamal felt a profound weight settle in his stomach. He remembered his arrogant laughter just 20 minutes prior. He remembered calling it a tomato steak. Shame, hot and sharp, burned the back of his neck. Then why bring it here, Jamal? Asked, looking between Loretta and Darius. Why now? Because Marcus is gone, Loretta said softly. And he made me promise that when he passed, the rifle would not just sit in a dark basement rotting away. He wanted the rust removed. He wanted the story preserved. Even if the world could not know his name for a while longer, he wanted someone to know what it meant, what he did. I track historical artifacts for the Defense OWMIA accounting agency, among other things, Darius said, opening his briefcase. Inside were stacks of thick manila folders in a specialized padded gun case. Loretta called me when Marcus passed. But to legally transfer this weapon back into a historical archive, it needs to be authenticated by a licensed third-party gunsmith. It needs a paper trail confirming the serial number has not been altered. Darius pulled a document from the briefcase and slid it across the glass counter toward Jamal. It was an official federal appraisal form. You laughed at her, son. Darius said, his eyes locking onto Jamal's. I cannot say I blame you. It looks like hell. But you also had the skill to uncover the truth without destroying the metal. So here is the real test. You are going to fill out this form. You are going to log the appraisal of a Class 3 historical artifact. Jamal picked up a pen. His hand was shaking slightly. What do I put for the value? Darius smiled, a grim, humorless expression. Put down $1, because you cannot put a price tag on a ghost. Jamal signed his name, officially documenting the existence of a weapon that history had tried to bury. He watched as Darius carefully, almost tenderly, lifted the rusted Springfield and placed it into the padded case. The heavy latches clicked shut, sealing the ghost of the Ardennes away once more. Loretta turned to leave, her burden finally lifted. Ma'am, Jamal called out, his voice thick with emotion. Loretta paused at the door. I am sorry, I laughed, and I am incredibly honored to have held your husband's rifle. Loretta offered a warm, genuine smile. Do not apologize, Jamal. Marcus always said the best secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight, looking like garbage. For 3 days after Darius Thompson walked out of the shop with the rusted Springfield, Jamal Mitchell could not sleep. The modern precision-engineered rifles hanging on his wall's weapons he had poured his soul into suddenly looked like sterile, soulless toys. They had never seen a frozen, blood-soaked forest. They had never stopped a Panzer division. He found himself standing at his workbench at 2 in the morning, staring at the empty patch of rubber mat where the relic had rested. The pungent ghost of ancient cosmoline and rust still hung faintly in the air. Something was gnawing at the edges of Jamal's mind. It was a sensory memory, a tiny detail from the moment he had clamped the rotting walnut stock into his padded vise. When the heavy jaws of the vise had compressed against the wood, Jamal had heard a sound. It was not the cracking of dry rot. It was a dull metallic clink, a subtle shifting of weight inside the buttstock. At the time, he had dismissed it as a broken cleaning kit rattling inside the stock's trapdoor compartment, a standard feature on military rifles of that era. But the OSS Hush Puppy did not have a standard stock. The trapdoor was usually sealed or removed to accommodate internal modifications for the suppressor's expansion chamber. Jamal could not shake the feeling that he had missed something. Marcus Davies had kept that rifle hidden for over 60 years. He had let it rust into oblivion. Why would a master mechanic, a man who spent his life maintaining complex diesel engines, allow a piece of precision machinery to degrade so horribly unless the rust itself was the camouflage? Unless the rifle was never meant to be fired again, but was instead serving as a vault. On Thursday morning, Jamal flipped the closed sign on his shop door. He climbed into his truck and drove across Cheyenne to the address Loretta Davies had left on the appraisal intake form. It was a modest single-story ranch house on a quiet tree-lined street. The paint was peeling slightly around the eaves, but the lawn was immaculately manicured. Jamal knocked on the front door, feeling a sudden wave of intrusion. He was a gunsmith, not a detective, but the ghost of Marcus Davies was pulling him in. Loretta opened the door. She looked surprised but not displeased to see him. She was wearing a thick cardigan and held a steaming mug of tea. Jamal, she said, her frail voice carrying a note of curiosity. Did the government send you back to tell me I owe them taxes on that old piece of iron? No, ma'am, Jamal said, taking off his baseball cap. Darius Thompson and the DOD have the rifle safely secured. I am here because I think I made a mistake. Loretta's eyes narrowed slightly. A mistake. When I examined the weapon, Jamal explained, stepping into the warm cinnamon-scented living room, I was so focused on the serial number on the receiver that I ignored the stock. When I clamped it down, I heard something inside the wood, something metal. Marcus did not just hide the rifle, Loretta. I think he hid something inside the rifle. Loretta stood frozen for a long moment. She looked toward the hallway, specifically toward a door that Jamal assumed led down to the basement. Mr. Thompson took the rifle to Washington, Loretta said softly. If there was something in it, it belongs to the Pentagon now. Maybe Jamal pressed. But the military will x-ray it. They will find it. If there is something in there, it is going to become classified government property. If Marcus wanted the government to have it, he would have handed it over in 1945. He kept it for a reason. And I think the answer to what is in that stock might be downstairs in his workshop. Loretta gripped her teacup tightly. For a moment, Jamal thought she was going to ask him to leave. Instead, she let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to carry decades of unspoken burdens. Marcus spent every evening down there, she whispered. He called it his sanctuary. After he passed, I could not bear to go down. Everything is exactly as he left it. If you want to look, Jamal, we can look. The basement of the Davies home was a stark contrast to the rusted decay of the Springfield rifle. As Jamal flipped the switch at the top of the wooden stairs, rows of bright fluorescent shop lights flickered to life, revealing an absolute masterclass in organization. It was not just a workbench, it was a fully outfitted machine shop. There was a Bridgeport milling machine, a metal lathe, and walls lined with pegboards where hundreds of wrenches, micrometers, and calipers hung in perfectly outlined shadows. Everything was spotless. The concrete floor was painted with gray epoxy and lacked a single drop of spilled oil. He was a perfectionist, Jamal murmured, running a hand over the immaculate cast iron of the lathe. The man who maintained this shop would never accidentally let a rifle rust to pieces. Marcus never did anything by accident, Loretta agreed, standing at the bottom of the stairs, her arms wrapped around herself. Jamal began to search. He did not know exactly what he was looking for. A blueprint, a diary, a loose floorboard. He opened heavy steel drawers filled with brass fittings and sorted through meticulously labeled coffee cans full of screws. 30 minutes passed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just the workshop of a highly skilled, highly organized mechanic. Jamal leaned against a heavy olive-drab metal footlocker tucked under the main workbench. It looked like standard military surplus, the kind veterans often use to store their uniforms and medals. Did you look in here, Jamal? Asked, gesturing to the footlocker. Just once, Loretta replied. Right after the funeral. It is just his old uniform, some rail yard pay stubs, and a few photo albums. Nothing hidden. Jamal knelt and unlatched the heavy brass clasps. The lid groaned open. Loretta was right. On top lay a neatly folded olive-drab wool tunic with the patch of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Beneath it were stacks of yellowed paperwork and a few leather-bound photo albums. But as Jamal shifted the heavy wool tunic, his hands brushed against the bottom of the trunk. He stopped. He pressed his knuckles against the sheet metal bottom and tapped. Thud, thud. It sounded dull solid. He knocked on the side of the trunk. Ping, ping, a hollow resonant ring. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs. Loretta, the internal depth of this trunk is about 4 inches shallower than the outside dimensions. He frantically began pulling the uniform and papers out, setting them gently on the pristine workbench. Once the trunk was empty, Jamal ran his fingers along the internal seams of the metal bottom. He found 2 tiny, almost microscopic holes drilled into the corners that was just large enough to fit the tips of a pair of snap ring pliers. Jamal scrambled to the pegboard, grabbed a pair of pliers, and inserted the fine metal tips into the holes. He twisted and pulled upward. With a scrape of metal on metal, the entire false bottom of the foot locker lifted away. Loretta gasped, taking a step back. Lying in the hidden compartment was not a diary nor a map. It was a pristine, meticulously oiled leather holster containing a German Luger P-08 pistol. Beside the pistol lay a heavy canvas-wrapped ledger in a small velvet jewelry box. Jamal carefully lifted the ledger. It was dense. He opened the velvet box. Inside rested a single heavy silver coin. It was not currency. It was a heavily tarnished SS Totenkopf ring, a death's head ring, awarded only to elite officers of the Nazi Schutzstaffel. The inside of the band was engraved with a name, Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Weber. "Dear God," Loretta whispered, staring at the skull insignia on the ring. "What is that?" Jamal set the ring down, his hands trembling slightly. He opened the heavy canvas ledger. It was not a diary of the war. The dates did not start in 1944. They started in 1958. The first page was written in Marcus's neat, blocky mechanic's handwriting. November 12th, 1958. Cheyenne, Wyoming. The ghost did not die in the snow. I heard his voice today at the Union Pacific loading dock. He speaks perfect English now. He calls himself Thomas Bradley. He is managing the new freight logistics company. The world thinks Heinrich Weber burned in a bunker in Berlin, but I know the sound of the man who ordered the executions at Malmedy. I know his voice. Jamal looked up, the air in the basement suddenly feeling ice cold. Loretta Jamal said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Marcus was not just hiding from his past. He was hunting it right here in Wyoming. Jamal and Loretta sat at the kitchen table. The canvas ledger opened between them. The tea had gone ice cold. For 2 hours, Jamal read aloud from the pages, piecing together a terrifying, invisible war that had been fought in the quiet streets of their hometown. According to the ledger, Marcus Davies had been part of a specialized OSS kill team before he was folded into the infantry lines at Bastogne. His primary target had been Heinrich Weber, a brutal SS intelligence officer responsible for orchestrating the massacres of captured American troops and local resistance fighters in Belgium. During the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, Weber had vanished. Military intelligence concluded he had been killed in an artillery strike, but Marcus knew better. And in 1958, working at the rail yard in Cheyenne, fate brought the hunter and the prey face to face. Weber had used the rat-line secret escape routes established by sympathetic officials and intelligence agencies who wanted to use Nazi scientists and spies for the Cold War to secure a new identity. He was Thomas Bradley, a respected, wealthy pillar of the Wyoming business community. Thomas Bradley, Loretta said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. I remember him. He funded the construction of the new county hospital in the 70s. He was always in the newspaper shaking hands with the mayor. He died of a heart attack maybe 20 years ago. Marcus could not just shoot him, Jamal said, reading from a page dated 1961. Listen to this. I cannot use the rifle. If Bradley is murdered, the police will investigate. They will dig into his past, but they will also dig into mine. I cannot risk the government uncovering the hush puppy or what I did in the Ardennes. They would take me away from Loretta. I must destroy him without a bullet. Jamal looked at Loretta, whose eyes were brimming with tears. Marcus had chosen a life with her over a momentary act of loud, violent vengeance, but he had not let Weber go free. The ledger detailed a decades-long campaign of psychological and financial sabotage. Marcus, the master mechanic, used his unparalleled knowledge of machinery and logistics to systematically dismantle Thomas Bradley's empire. May 1964, adjusted the braking pressure valves on Bradley's 3 primary freight trucks. They will fail under heavy load on the mountain pass. The insurance claim will ruin his quarterly profits. August 1971, Bradley is expanding into chemical transport. A microscopic fracture in the pressure seal of the holding tanks applied with a diamond file will ensure a localized leak. The EPA finding will destroy his expansion. October 1982. Bradley is running for state senate. I accessed his private office during the weekend maintenance shift. I left the Luger on his desk unloaded, resting on top of his campaign flyers. Let him know the ghost is in the room. He drove him mad, Jamal whispered in awe. Marcus did not kill him physically. He bled him dry. He destroyed his businesses, ruined his political ambitions, and made him live in a state of constant paranoid terror. Jamal flipped out to the very last page of the ledger. It was dated a week before Marcus had passed away. The handwriting was shaky. The ink faded. Bradley's heart finally gave out in '98, but the money he stole, the blood money from Europe, was hidden. He converted it to bearer bonds. He hid them from the IRS, from his family, from everyone. But I watched him. I watched him hide the safety deposit box key. I took it. I hollowed out the stock of the Springfield. I put the key inside behind the steel butt plate. I let the rifle rust so no thief would ever want it. If Loretta ever needs help, she will take it to a gunsmith, someone smart enough to clean the steel, but honest enough not to steal it. Jamal slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. He stared at Loretta, the phantom rattle, the metallic clink he had heard in the vise. It was not a broken cleaning rod. It was the key to a dead Nazi's hidden fortune secured inside the rotting stock of the very weapon meant to kill him. Darius Thompson took the rifle, Jamal said, panic rising in his chest. Loretta, the DOD, is going to put that rifle in a secure vault in Washington, D.C. They are going to log it as an artifact. They might never open the butt plate. Loretta slowly reached across the table and placed her frail, wrinkled hand over Jamal's. She was not panicking. She was smiling a sharp, cunning smile that suddenly reminded Jamal that she had been married to a master spy for 60 years. Darius Thompson is a good man, Loretta said smoothly. His grandfather helped Marcus in 1945. Darius came all the way from Washington just to authenticate the receiver. He owed Marcus a debt. Jamal frowned, all confused. What does that have to do with the key? Loretta reached into the pocket of her thick wool cardigan. She pulled her hand out and placed a small, heavy object on the open page of the ledger. It was a long brass safety deposit box key stamped with the logo of the oldest bank in downtown Cheyenne. Jamal's jaw dropped. How? How do you have that? I heard it rattling inside the stock, Loretta said, her eyes twinkling with a fierce, brilliant light. You heard a rusty bolt. I dropped down the cleaning tube. Marcus told me about the key the night before he died. We retrieved it together, but Marcus knew the rifle was too important to history to just throw away. He was right. He wanted the government to have it back, but he knew if he just mailed it to the Pentagon, some bureaucrat would lock it in a drawer. She tapped the heavy brass key. Marcus said the only way to ensure the rifle was respected was to make the government authenticate it themselves. He made me promise to take it to the best gunsmith in town. He said, find that arrogant kid with the fancy shop. Let him discover the serial number. Let him call Darius. The kid will build a paper trail, and the government will take the rifle back with honors. Jamal sat back in his chair, completely stunned. He had been played. He had been a pawn in a dead man's brilliant final logistical maneuver. And he was not even mad. He was completely, utterly outmatched. So Jamal breathed, looking at the key. What is in the box, Loretta? Loretta picked up the SS ring and dropped it into her teacup, where it sank to the bottom with a dull clink. Marcus said it was a little over $3 million in untraceable 1940s bearer bonds, she said calmly. And tomorrow morning, Jamal, you are going to drive me to the bank because I believe Marcus would want to make a very large anonymous donation to the Defense POWMIA accounting agency. After all, the ghosts deserved to be brought home. The morning sky over Cheyenne was a brittle, cloudless blue, the kind of Wyoming winter day that threatened to crack the windshield with sheer cold. Jamal Mitchell drove his heavy-duty pickup truck with the heater blasting, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the chill settling in his bones. Sitting in the passenger seat, Loretta Davies looked as serene as a woman heading to Sunday service. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her thick wool cardigan buttoned to the collar, and her leather purse clutched tightly against her side. Inside that purse was a heavy brass key that belonged to a dead monster stolen by a dead hero. "Are you sure about this?" Loretta Jamal asked, his voice tight. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "We are talking about millions of dollars in untraceable assets tied to an SS war criminal. The moment we open that box, we are stepping into federal jurisdiction, maybe international jurisdiction. Marcus stepped into federal jurisdiction the day he smuggled a classified suppressor out of a war zone." Loretta replied calmly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "He navigated it for 60 years. I think we can manage one morning at the bank." Jamal shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and profound respect washing over him. Yesterday, he was just a gunsmith arguing with an old woman about a rusted piece of steel. Today, he was an accomplice to an international posthumous heist. They pulled up to the imposing granite facade of the First National Bank of Cheyenne. It was a historic building constructed in the late 1800s with heavy brass doors and a lobby that smelled of floor wax and old money. Jamal parked, walked around the truck, and offered Loretta his arm. She took it, her grip surprisingly strong. Inside the bank was quiet. Jamal walked Loretta up to the heavy mahogany desk of the branch manager, a balding, sharply dressed white man named Richard Sterling. "Mrs. Davies." Richard smiled, standing up and adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "It is a pleasure to see you. My condolences again regarding Marcus. He was a good man. How can First National help you today?" "Thank you, Richard," Loretta said smoothly. "I am here to access a safe deposit box. It belonged to an old business associate of my husband's, Thomas Bradley. Marcus was named the executor of this specific asset upon Mr. Bradley's passing, but the key was misplaced until yesterday." Richard's brow furrowed. "Thomas Bradley, the logistics magnate. He passed away over 20 years ago, Mrs. Davies. His estate was settled a long time ago. His public estate was settled." Loretta corrected her tone, leaving no room for argument. She reached into her purse and placed the heavy brass key on the polished mahogany. Stamped onto the brass was the number 404. This box was paid for in cash for a 99-year lease in 1968. "I believe you will find it in your subterranean vault." Richard looked at the key, then typed rapidly on his computer terminal. As he read the screen, his complexion paled slightly. "Well, it appears you are correct. Box 404 listed under a holding corporation with Marcus Davies named as the sole surviving signatory. I, I had no idea this account existed. It predates our digital archives. I had to pull it from the legacy mainframe." "Take us down," Richard Loretta said. Jamal felt his heart hammering against his ribs as they followed the manager down a spiral marble staircase into the basement of the bank. They approached a massive circular steel vault door that looked like it belonged on a battleship. Richard spun the combination dial, hauled back the heavy locking levers, and pulled the cage door open. The air inside the vault was dry, cool, and carried a metallic tang. The walls were lined with thousands of small steel doors. Richard led them to the very back to a section of oversized heavy-duty boxes. He stopped at box 404. "I will need to use the master key to disengage the primary lock, and then you will use yours," Richard explained, inserting his key and turning it with a heavy clack. He stepped back. "Bank policy dictates I leave you in private. There is a viewing room right through that door." "Thank you," Richard Loretta said. Once the manager was gone, Jamal stepped forward. His hands were actually shaking. He took the heavy brass key from Loretta, inserted it into the secondary slot, and turned. The lock disengaged with a solid, definitive thud. Jamal grabbed the handle and pulled. The steel drawer was roughly 2 feet deep and a foot wide. It was incredibly heavy. Jamal hauled it out and carried it into the private viewing room, setting it down on the fluorescent-lit table. Loretta stood beside him. "Open it, Jamal," she whispered. He unlatched the lid and threw it back. Inside, there were no gold bars, no diamonds, no stacks of crisp $100 bills. Instead, the box was packed to the brim with stacks of thick, high-quality parchment paper bundled tightly with dry-rotted rubber bands. Jamal reached in and pulled out the top stack. The paper was heavy, deeply engraved, and covered in intricate filigreed borders. He read the heavy Gothic script at the top. Swiss Confederation. Jamal breathed, his eyes scanning the denominations. Bearer bonds issued in 1943. Loretta, these are for 50,000 Swiss francs each. He dug deeper into the box. There were bundles of German industrial bonds, American Treasury certificates from the 1950s, and stock certificates for global shipping conglomerates. None of them had a name attached. A bearer bond is exactly what it sounds like. Whoever physically holds the paper owns the money. It was the ultimate untraceable currency of the mid-20th century. Heinrich Weber was an intelligence officer, Loretta said, staring at the stacks of paper. Marcus always suspected Weber did not just escape the war. He profited from it. He likely plundered local treasuries in Belgium and France, converting the gold into Swiss bearer bonds before the Reich collapsed. He used this blood money to build Thomas Bradley's empire in America. Jamal quickly did the math in his head, factoring in inflation and the sheer volume of the certificates in the box. Marcus's estimate of 3 million was laughably conservative. Loretta, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, there has to be 10, maybe 15 million here. If you try to cash these, the IRS, the Treasury Department, the FBI, everyone will come down on you. I have no intention of cashing them, Jamal, Loretta said, reaching out to touch the cold parchment. This money is stained with the blood of the people my husband tried to save in the Ardennes. It does not belong to me. Then what are we doing here? Loretta reached into her purse again and pulled out a modern, sleek smartphone, a stark contrast to her vintage cardigan. We are going to make a phone call. She dialed a number from memory and put it on speakerphone. It rang twice before a gruff professional voice answered. Darius Thompson. Darius, it is Loretta Davies, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the small steel-walled viewing room. I trust the Springfield made it back to Washington securely. There was a pause on the line. It did, Loretta. It is currently in a secure vault at the DOD. We are beginning the provenance paperwork today. Why are you calling? Because my husband did not just leave you a rifle, Loretta said, looking at Jamal. He left you a negotiation. Jamal and I are currently standing in a subterranean vault at First National in Cheyenne. We are looking at a safety deposit box filled with approximately 15 million in 1940s era bearer bonds. They belong to Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Weber. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For 5 agonizing seconds, Jamal thought the call had dropped. Loretta Darius finally spoke, his voice dangerously low, entirely stripped of its previous warmth. Do you have any idea what you are looking at? If those bonds are what you say they represent stolen Nazi assets smuggled onto American soil. That is classified federal evidence. They represent Marcus's final victory, Loretta corrected sharply. He tracked Weber down. He destroyed him and he secured the assets. Now, Darius, you are going to get on a plane and you are going to come back to Wyoming. We have a deal to make. The United States government does not make deals regarding stolen international assets, Loretta. Then I suppose I will just take these bonds, walk upstairs and hand them to a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, Loretta countered without missing a beat. I am sure they would love to run a front-page story about how the OSS allowed a high-ranking SS officer to settle in Wyoming, build a logistics empire, and rub shoulders with state senators while the federal government looked the other way. Especially when that officer was being hunted by a black veteran who had saved thousands of lives at Bastogne but could not get a medal because the mission was classified and the optics were complicated. I am sure that story would go over very well in 2010. Jamal stared at Loretta, his mouth slightly open. She was blackmailing the Department of Defense, and she was doing it flawlessly. Do not move, Darius growled through the speaker. Do not leave that bank. I am dispatching a federal transport team from Denver right now. I will be in Cheyenne in 4 hours. Loretta ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse. She looked up at Jamal, offering a gentle, almost grandmotherly smile. Well, she said, I suppose we should get comfortable. 4 hours later, the quiet atmosphere of the First National Bank was shattered. The lobby was locked down. Three black unmarked SUVs sat idling on the curb outside their flashing strobe lights, reflecting off the granite pillars. Inside the vault, the air was suffocatingly tense. Darius Thompson had returned, but he was not alone. Standing beside him was a tall, sharply dressed white man in his 40s with cold, analytical eyes. He carried a leather briefcase and introduced himself as Harrison Croft, senior legal counsel for the Department of the Treasury. Two heavily armed federal agents stood by the vault door. Croft was currently wearing white cotton gloves, carefully inspecting the Swiss bearer bonds under the harsh fluorescent light of the viewing room. Fascinating, Croft murmured, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. The serial numbers on these certificates match the ledgers of the Swiss National Bank from 1943. These are part of the ghost train assets funds heavily suspected to have been laundered by SS intelligence officers right before the fall of Berlin. They have been missing for over half a century. Croft placed the bomb back in the box and turned his cold gaze to Loretta. Mrs. Davies, you are in possession of illicit stolen funds. By law, these assets belong to the United States Treasury to be held in trust or repatriated to European governments, pending an international tribunal. We are seizing this box immediately. You are not seizing anything, Mr. Croft, Loretta said, sitting straight-backed in a rigid metal chair. Jamal stood right behind her, his arms crossed, trying to look much more intimidating than he actually felt. You are accepting a donation. Croft offered a patronizing smile. You do not dictate terms to the federal government, ma'am. Your husband harbored a war criminal and withheld international assets. Frankly, if he were alive, I would be drafting an indictment for treason. Before Loretta could respond, Jamal stepped forward. The arrogance that had defined him as a hotshot gunsmith had vanished, replaced by a fierce protective loyalty to the legacy of a man he had never met. You draft an indictment, Croft, Jamal said, his voice booming in the small room. And I will personally drive Loretta to every news station in the state. Marcus Davies did not harbor a war criminal. He eliminated him. He spent 60 years destroying Thomas Bradley's life, while your vaunted intelligence agencies were busy giving former Nazis high-paying jobs to build rockets and run spy rings. And let us be clear about something else. Marcus Davies was a black man who saved thousands of lives in Belgium, but could not get a Medal of Honor because his mission was classified, and because in 1945, the military was not comfortable with celebrating a black sharpshooter who had killed dozens of white officers, even if they were Nazis. So he came home. He worked as a mechanic for 40 years. He paid his taxes. He went to church. And when he found the monster who had escaped justice, he spent 6 decades making sure that monster paid without ever firing a single bullet. You want to call that treason? I call it the most patient act of justice I have ever seen. Darius Thompson held up a hand, silencing Croft before the lawyer could snap back. Darius looked at Loretta, his expression softening slightly. He recognized the tactical brilliance of what Marcus had done. What do you want, Loretta? Darius asked quietly. You did not call me to get arrested. You called me to negotiate. Marcus planned this. I know he did. Loretta nodded. She reached into her purse and pulled out the heavy canvas ledger they had found in the false bottom of the footlocker. She slid it across the table toward Darius. That is my husband's confession, his intelligence log, and the definitive proof of Thomas Bradley's true identity, as Heinrich Weber, Loretta said. It is also proof of how the money was secured. Here are my terms, Darius. First, the federal government will take quiet, immediate possession of these bonds. You will liquidate them through whatever shadow accounts you use. Croft scoffed. We do not. Shut up, Harrison. Darius snapped, never taking his eyes off Loretta. Go on. Second, Loretta continued. Every single dime of those liquidated funds will be anonymously funneled into the Defense P. OWMIA accounting agency. It will be used to fund expeditions to Europe and the Pacific to bring our missing boys home. The blood money of an SS officer will be used to bury American heroes. Darius's eyes widened slightly. He looked down at the box of bonds, suddenly realizing the poetic justice of the demand. And third, Loretta said, her voice finally trembling with emotion, "My husband's rifle. The Springfield 1903. It will not be locked in a dark drawer in the Pentagon. It will be placed in the National Museum of the United States Army. And the display plaque will not say unknown operative. It will say Marcus Davies, the ghost of the Ardennes." Croft shook his head furiously. "Impossible. The Hush Puppy program is still technically classified in its operational details. Acknowledging Davies acknowledges the assassination team. We cannot put his name on a plaque next to a suppressed weapon. It violates 30 different protocols." "Then break them," Jamal interjected, stepping up to the table. "You bureaucrats classify history to hide your own mistakes. Marcus Davies saved thousands of men at Bastogne. You owe him his name. If you want the $15 million to fund your agencies without a public scandal, you give the mechanic his due. You give the black veteran who was never properly honored in his lifetime the recognition he deserves in death." Darius looked at Jamal, then at the ledger, and finally at the mountain of bearer bonds. He was a man who had spent his life dealing in government secrets, balancing the scales of justice in the dark. He knew when he was beaten, and more importantly, he knew when the right thing to do aligned perfectly with the practical thing to do. "Harrison," Darius said, turning to the Treasury lawyer, "draft the asset seizure forms, classify them under National Security Directive 47. The funds will be routed to the DPAA by Friday." "Darius, you cannot be serious. I am the senior defense intelligence liaison in this room, Harrison." "Do it," Darius barked, his military authority flashing to the surface. He turned back to Loretta. "The rifle will go to the museum, Loretta. But the bureaucracy of declassification takes time. It will not happen overnight. And the rifle, it is a mess. The rust is eating through the receiver. If we put it in a display case as it is, it will crumble to dust in 20 years. Darius looked up at Jamal. "Mr. Mitchell, you found the serial number without destroying the steel. The DoD requires a certified master gunsmith to halt the oxidation process and stabilize the artifact for museum display. We need someone who understands the chemical makeup of 1940s ordnance steel, but who also understands that the damage is part of the history. Are you willing to take a federal contract?" Jamal looked at Loretta. She gave him a tiny, proud nod. "I will do it," Jamal said, "but I am not making it look new. I am just stopping the rust. The scars stay. That is exactly what we want," Darius said, extending his hand. Jamal shook it. The deal was struck. It was late April, 5 months after the frail woman with the burlap sack had walked into Mitchell Tactical and Precision. The shop was closed to the public. The modern carbon fiber chassis rifles and high-end optics had been pushed to the edges of the room. The center of the shop was dedicated entirely to one item. Jamal Mitchell sat at his workbench wearing magnifying loupes and a pair of white cotton gloves. The Springfield M1903 serial number 4101934 was clamped gently in a specialized padded jig. It had taken Jamal 3 months of painstaking microscopic work. He had not reblued the steel. Doing so would have erased the history. Instead, he had used specialized conservation chemicals, tannic acid and microcrystalline wax, to halt the active red rust, converting it into a stable dark magnetite patina. He had carefully injected stabilizing resins into the rotting walnut stock, freezing the decay in place. The massive custom routed suppressor was still heavily pitted, but it was no longer crumbling. The rifle did not look new. It looked like a survivor. It looked like a weapon that had spent 4 days in the freezing snow of Bastogne. The bell above the front door chimed. Jamal looked up, pulling the loupes from his eyes. Loretta Davies walked in, supported by Darius Thompson. Loretta looked a little more fragile than she had in the winter, but her eyes were still bright. Darius was in his standard crisp suit, carrying a heavy velvet-lined Pelican case. "It is finished," Jamal said, stepping away from the bench to let them approach. Loretta walked up to the workbench and looked down at the rifle. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers hovering just inches over the stabilized steel. She did not touch it. She did not need to. It is beautiful, Jamal, she whispered. It looks exactly how Marcus described it. Dark, quiet, heavy. It is stabilized, ma'am, Jamal said softly. It will look exactly like this for the next 200 years. Darius stepped forward and handed Jamal a thick manila folder. Your federal contract payment, Mr. Mitchell, and your security clearance paperwork for the transfer. Jamal opened the folder. Inside was a government check for his services and a pristine heavy stock photograph. It was a picture of a newly installed glass display case at the National Museum of the United States Army in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Inside the case was an empty mount waiting for the rifle. Below the mount was a solid bronze plaque. Jamal read the engraving out loud, his voice thick with emotion. The OSS Hush Puppy, Springfield. Ma'am, 1903, carried behind enemy lines during the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Operated by Marcus Davies, United States Army, the Ghost of the Ardennes. He held the line in the dark so others could live in the light. Loretta closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Marcus had been a man of the shadows, a mechanic who spent his life fixing broken things and hunting the monsters that history forgot. He had never asked for a medal. He had never asked for recognition. But thanks to his final brilliant logistical puzzle, the world would know his name. Darius gently placed the stabilized Springfield into the velvet-lined Pelican case. He locked the latches with a definitive click. We are flying to Washington tonight, Loretta, Darius said softly. The museum director is waiting. The installation ceremony is tomorrow morning. Just us, the director, and the Secretary of the Army. Would you like to carry the key to the case? Loretta nodded, accepting a small silver key from Darius. She turned to Jamal and took both of his hands in hers. You laughed at me when I brought this in, Jamal, she said, a teasing lilt returning to her voice. Jamal blushed, bowing his head slightly. I was an arrogant kid, Loretta. I thought I knew everything about guns. I thought they were just math and metal. And now, she asked. Jamal looked at the locked case. Now I know that the metal does not matter. It is the ghost holding it that changes the world. Thank you for making me clean the serial number. Loretta smiled, patted his cheek, and turned to leave with Darius. Jamal stood in the quiet of his shop long after they were gone. He looked at the modern, perfect rifles on his wall. They were beautiful machines. But as he turned off the overhead lights, plunging the shop into darkness, he knew none of them would ever be as perfect as a rotting, rusted piece of scrap iron that had saved the world. Jamal locked the door and stepped out into the cold Wyoming night. He looked up at the sky filled with stars. He thought about Marcus Davies, the black man who never got a medal, who never got recognition, who spent his life in a machine shop hunting monsters at night. And in the end, through one perfect logistical plan, ensured his name would be engraved on bronze. Justice served cold. And the ghost finally brought home. There is a distinct difference between a piece of junk and a piece of history, though to the untrained eye they often look exactly the same. But those who know how to look, those who take the time to clean off the rust, they find the ghosts who held the line when everyone else fell. And those ghosts deserve the light.